My name is Alisa, and I work with the City of Southfield this summer to conduct a vulnerability assessment. To get us started, I thought I'd introduce the team. So I've had my intro, but I worked with Suzanne Yusuf, who's the sustainability planner at the City of Southfield. Together we collaborated with Cassie Barris, who lent her expertise as a GIS analyst at the Southeast Michigan Council of Governments, or SUNCOG. Before I get into my report, I wanted to take a minute to talk about what it means to serve your community as a municipality. Beyond the basic services of trash pickup and snow clearing, public servants like Suzanne have shown me the real motivation behind this work, which is to help communities thrive. And I think that a vulnerability assessment is just one step in realizing that goal. And so I hope that the report that I put together and the guide that I've created can help you guys do what you do best, which is to serve the people that you care about. So now we can get started. I think we have to start first with understanding what vulnerability is. And the definition that you see here on screen was developed by the World Health Organization. And I think it does a pretty good job of summarizing what vulnerability means in this context. But something that I noticed as I began this report is that there's no standardized way to define or assess vulnerability. But something I did notice as I was going through different example reports and other work is that there are three key components that are analyzed across the board. And they come together to form this framework or formula of sustainability, or of vulnerability. We have exposure times sensitivity minus adaptive capacity. Exposure is the impact of the environment, something like exposure to pollutants. Sensitivity are the sensitivities of the people. That might be something like rates of housing burden. And adaptive capacity is the ability of these communities to respond and recover from hazards. And I just wanted to mention that though adaptive capacity is a huge part of assessing vulnerability, it didn't fit into the scope of my project this summer. So it is part of my recommendations for the report that I wrote, but I won't be going into it. I won't be going into it today.
No, I'm just listening. I wanted to review the data that I used. As I've kind of referenced, climate vulnerability assessments can be very flexible. They are highly adaptable to different kinds of data or focuses. But my work this summer focused on the use of environmental justice screening tools, which are GIS tools that identify communities that might be impacted by environmental hazards. And the way that these tools work is that they utilize hazard data to generate percentiles that give a relative understanding of vulnerability. They don't provide hard measurements of exposure or sensitivity data, but they provide the potential of risk. So the closer you are to the 99th percentile, the higher the chance of risk in any given area. And these tools are great for providing an initial big picture understanding of what vulnerability might look like in your municipality. So these are the three tools that I used this summer, and I'll actually start with my EJ screen. My EJ screen is an EJ screening tool that's run by Eagle, and it provides statewide percentiles, meaning that all of the data it uses is from within the state of Michigan. And it acted as my primary source of data. The Climate Vulnerability Index functions very similarly, but on a nationwide scale, and it acted as my secondary source of data. And then the Climate and Economic Justice Screening Tool is actually where we started this report. It's kind of where Suzanne saw where vulnerability existed in Southfield, but I think this map kind of shows why I moved away from this tool. While it does a great job of pinpointing where vulnerability exists and where it might be concentrated, I thought that it didn't really provide a whole picture or a holistic understanding of vulnerability. So my EJ screen gives the different degrees of vulnerability that exist across the city and helps to build context to understand, what do these hazards look like. In addition to screening tools, I use demographic data, and I sourced most of it from two tools that were developed by SEMCOG. One is the demographic emphasis areas, and the other is the community profiles. And these tools are super user-friendly, publicly available, and they kind of compile demographic data in a way that's already geared towards vulnerability. So I think that for this kind of report and other municipal projects, it just makes the data very easily accessible. Now that we have kind of a background understanding of what went into this report, I wanted to walk through the key components together as if we are doing this report together. And all the things that I just spoke about are things that would actually go into your introduction along with general, establishing information. And here I have the title page for my report, which will be found on the CLC website, along with a guide that kind of outlines the structures and methodologies I used to write this report. So let's hop into context. And the context section of the report essentially is the chance for you to introduce your municipality. It familiarizes the reader with the site of study and kind of sets the stage for the rest of the report. And you might include baseline information here, like how big the city is, where it's located in the wider region, residential population information. And I think another really important component of this section is to highlight influential physical components of your city. So that might be something like highways or rivers or the presence of industry that can influence vulnerability. After you've established context, you can really get into the data analysis, and that will be housed in the exposure and sensitivity sections of your report. And this is also where you'll spend the bulk of your report. The methodologies for both of these sections are pretty much the same, the way that you analyze them. They just look at different indicators. So I've included some examples of indicators that you might examine under exposure and sensitivity. Things like proximity to hazardous waste facilities or rates of asthma. I wanted to highlight the indicators that I ended up looking at for Southfield. They totaled to around 40 indicators, mostly sourced from my EJ screen and also from CDI. And one thing I also wanted to mention is that all of these indicators are measured at the census tract level. And Southfield has 23 census tracts. So I have 23 pieces of data that are tied to each of these indicators. And that's just a huge amount of data to look at. So to kind of make sense of that for myself and for whoever's reading this report, I created sort of buckets or levels of vulnerability into which I put my data. And so this provides a quick understanding of where a census tract might lie, regarding vulnerability without me having to constantly talk about the indicator score or the percentile score. And high-level vulnerability tracks, this is all self-determined. I came up with this scale myself. High vulnerability is the top 20%, mid-level is everything above the majority, and then low level is anything that falls under the majority. So now that you have an understanding of the methodology, I thought that we could walk through the way that I would analyze each indicator. And so I've picked particulate matter 2.5 as an example. So the first thing that I would do is go into my EJ screen, and that's the map that you see on the screen right now. And I would pull each of the indicator scores for each of the census tracts in Southfield, and that's the table that you see on the left. After I've compiled all of my data, I'll then calculate the degree of vulnerability. So that's how many census tracts are falling into high vulnerability based on their indicator score. How many in mid, how many in low, etc. Then once I've done all of that, I've collected all of that data, I'll do the most important thing, which is to determine significance. So unfortunately for PM 2.5, 100% of census tracts in Southfield fall into high vulnerability. And that is really significant. I'm definitely going to talk about that in the report. But for another indicator, it might be that 25% of census tracts fall into high vulnerability, 15% fall into mid-level vulnerability. And so judging and deciding what is significant in your report is something that you'll have to do. And I think that there are a variety of methodologies that you can use I ended up sticking to around 20 to 25% as my cutoff for significance. Southfield has a population of 76,000 people. 25% of that is 20,000 people, and that felt significant to me. And so that's when, I would cut off, that's what determined my significance and what shaped what I would speak about in the report. So here I wanted to highlight just the findings from this section of the report. These are the major issues and topics that are shaping vulnerability in the city. And I think it provides a great high-level, general understanding of what's shaping vulnerability in the city. But I was interested in exploring where vulnerability might be concentrated and what's shaping high vulnerability specifically in the city. And that kind of inspired the next part of this report, which is looking at areas of especially high vulnerability. And these are census tracts that are displaying high vulnerability across multiple indicators. And I'll walk through the methodology of how I did this as well. So the first thing, or the methods that I used were statistical analysis, and I used that term very loosely because all I did was examine each indicator individually, find the average of that score and its standard deviation, and I added those together to get a threshold score. So any indicator score that fell above one standard deviation of the mean per indicator, that was that qualified to display heightened exposure or heightened sensitivity. And that represents like the top 16% of data. So that was significantly higher than what other tracks were displaying. And so that was step one, to see what indicators are higher for exposure and sensitivity. And these were the indicators that were most frequently identified. And they kind of highlight what's shaping high vulnerability specifically. And maybe it can be considered like what you might want to prioritize when you're addressing vulnerability. The second part of this was to identify census tracts that display especially high vulnerability. And if you remember, vulnerability is a function of both exposure and sensitivity. So I was looking for census tracts with 3 or more indicators displaying heightened exposure and heightened sensitivity. And from all of that analysis, I ended up identifying 4 census tracts, which you can see on the map here. In addition to kind of going in depth about what indicators were, experienced in these census tracts, I had some additional considerations from the demographic emphasis areas, which included transit dependence, no-car households, and households in poverty. And I go into much more detail about this in my report, so please check it out if you're interested. The last part of my report is recommendations. And for the sake of time, I'll just highlight the second bullet point that says pursue further investigation. If you decide to use screening tools to write your vulnerability assessment, I think further investigation is an absolute for your recommendations. Because these screening tools are not providing hard measurements, further investigations on like risk assessments for air quality or proximity to traffic or health, those can confirm your findings from this initial vulnerability assessment. So yeah, that's everything.